Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm going to give everyone a minute to get signed in. While we're waiting to get started, I'll do some quick introductions and take care of a few housekeeping items. I'm Jessie Beringer, Head of Marketing for 3D Group, and I'll be facilitating our session today. Joining me to discuss 360 feedback is 3D Group President Dr. Dale Rose. Dr. Rose is a nationally recognized expert on talent assessment, coaching, and 360 feedback. Dr. Rose personally coaches over 100 leaders per year, including focused post-360 feedback sessions and also more long-term engagements. While he most frequently works at the executive and C-suite level, he's supported leaders at every level, from board chair to first-line supervisor. In addition to his coaching and assessment work, Dr. Rose is a widely published author in academic journals and an author and co-editor of the recently released Handbook of Strategic 360 Feedback. Please feel free to ask questions throughout the presentation using the chat box on your GoToWebinar control panel. We'll be answering as many of your questions as we can at the end. So thank you all for joining us today for 9 factors that will make or break your 360 process. Dale, I'll hand it over to you to get started.
Thanks, Jessie, and thanks to all of you for joining me today. I'd like to acknowledge my co-editors of the handbook here, where some of this material comes from. The topic today is 9. We were going to get 10, but it just worked out that it was 9. So usually it's the top 10, bottom 10, but we've got 9 factors that I'd like to explore and discuss really, the things that we see in our 25 years of doing this work, where 360 processes can really fall down or really accelerate. A lot of these ideas are things that have come about again over those years and years of experience. But one of the things that we find in the literature and if you read about 360s is they're fairly consistent. So it turns out that a lot of these factors are also covered throughout the book. So rather than trying to get too much into the detail of each factor, I'm going to cover each one briefly and then try to provide a story or an example so that we can use some sort of case studies, if you will. Again, not with a ton of detail on each with the amount of time I have, but at least enough to give you a picture of kind of what it can look like when it really struggles or when it really thrives. I think the other thing is we had a bunch of great questions for folks that registered, so I'm going to try to move quickly enough that we can cover those. Some of them I may be able to cover as we go, but I want to make sure we address some of these great questions that you folks had and whatnot. So with that, let me jump forward. So the first bit of the first factor really is clarity of purpose. This is a kind of a design factor that needs to be considered very much up front, and you almost can't put too much time into the planning part of what you're doing. The sort of ready, shoot, aim just does not work very well. So, simple version of this is, are you going to be using it for development or decision making? This has been a long-standing discussion. It's starting to kind of morph to where really people are recognizing that there isn't a huge, a big bright line between those things, that almost all 360s are used for development, but they're also used for decision making. And our research finds that over half the companies that use 360s use it for more than one purpose. But at the same time, the way you design the process will have a huge impact on the results. And so being clear about what that purpose is and then communicating it outward is extremely important. Just one brief example, we do about twice a year, we do a strategic 360 forum where we get companies together to share their current practices and learn from each other. And this is about 3 years ago. I remember one company sharing that they had done a large-scale process with thousands and thousands of leaders, and we were kind of exploring this notion of impact and what the process looked like and what kind of impact it was having and why they were doing it. And they sort of flippantly shared that they had learned, because they could log, who logged in, that only 42% of the leaders who'd participated even opened their report. So I think here's an example where the purpose of it was clearly not stated enough that the leaders valued it. So hopefully none of you will ever find yourself in that circumstance. partially because you spent the time on being clear about why are we doing this, what do we expect leaders to get out of it, what's the value to them, and that's really what clarity of purpose is about. So here's a case example. A company that we worked with is a Fortune 500 pharmaceutical company, had a new sales leader, new to the organization, a large group of, I think, 400 or so sales leaders. And he really wanted to change. When he kind of looked at the approach the company was taking to their sales, he really wanted to change the strategy to, from what he termed as a sort of transactional approach to a much more relational or relationship-based selling. And so as he started to try to lay out the strategy for this, his HR business partners were starting to kind of, question whether or not it was going to work. And he was a little frustrated with this. And so he asked, well, what's the concern? And they said, well, we're just not really sure the talent that you've got here is ready for this, that we're not sure they have the skills that are needed to implement this strategy. And so he said, great, well, how do we find out? And indeed, what they ended up doing was doing an assessment process that included a 360 to try to figure out, well, do I have the kind of skills that I need to implement this strategy? And so I think being really clear about, this is the purpose for it, helped drive things. Interestingly, in this particular case, the leader didn't even really want the participants to get the report. He had his own purpose. His purpose was simply to, understand whether he could move forward with this strategy, and the idea that they would get the feedback themselves was sort of ancillary to that. So it was an interesting case, I think, of dual purposes. The HR business partners were able to convince him that the leaders getting the report actually had a significant value and was a way to kind of get, in a sense, an added ROI. But it was dual purpose, and so being very clear with people about it, that you're going to get your report, there's going to be development here, but we're also using it to help inform our new sales leader, was, I think, critical for for the organization and for the participants to know what they were getting into. And importantly, the data were actually used to delay that strategy. So when he looked at the data, he realized that he was way out ahead of his group and was able to use that to sort of delay the strategy. It's not that he didn't pursue that, but instead what they did was they took the developmental aspect of the process and used that to build up those skills and in a sense, get those leaders ready for what was coming. And they went a little bit more slowly. I think over time they were able to get a bunch of those leaders there, and then they were also able to identify leaders who weren't ready, and they themselves understood that they weren't ready, and found other places to go and support the organization. So I think, again, just this idea that you're clear about your purpose has a huge impact should have a huge impact on the implementation, and can have a huge impact on the results you get. If you just jump forward and go, let's just do 360s, you're not likely to get there. The other factor, and this actually I think came up in a couple of the questions, the second factor to consider is really around organizational readiness. So, just implementing a 360 because it seems like a good idea or you have a clear purpose that you want, you really have to look at the organization and recognize, is it ready? 360s are more than an impact on the individual themselves that's getting the feedback. You can really touch a broad swath of the system. So you might get 12 or 13 surveys filled out on each person. That's a whole lot of people involved in this process. So you want to make sure that the organization's ready, that it's supportive, the culture is there for to support this kind of process. You really need senior management buy-in. I think when we see 360s that are done kind of from the bottom up, it can be problematic. There's a sort of something about leading by example that I think is important. And so if you're rolling out a process, one of the best ways to do it is to start at the top and move down. One of the great things there is that if the person at the top of the organization is getting feedback about him or herself, that feedback is being provided by the people below that leader. So they get a little bit of a sample of it before, the next cycle when they participate and get their own feedback. So they've got an idea of how it works, and you can really see sort of, oh, okay, they're taking this seriously. They're not doing this to me. They're involved and they're using it, and they can model how best to use the information. So organizational readiness can't be understated. An interesting example we ran into, we were working with a mobile phone provider. It's actually in an Asian country, and they wanted all the leaders in their research and development unit to receive feedback. It was a group of about, I think the R&D function was about 300 people all told. But there had been, I think on the surface there was quite a bit of concern that they were not really ready for this, that there had been some vindictive behaviors by leaders in the past. There was a fairly kind of low level of trust. But the HR department really felt that opening up conversations, using the tool as a way to break through some of this was important, and she was really excited about it. And so we cautioned her that just jumping in and throwing surveys out there is likely to not work very well. So we really encouraged her to have a sort of a town hall orientation meeting where raters and participants could all be in the same space. It was a small enough group that we could get 300 people in a room. If you've got 300,000 people, this is a little tougher to do. But in this instance, we literally got 300 people in the room, kind of walked through the process, told them what was going to happen, who was going to get reports, how we protected their identities, a little bit of an idea of the content, expectations of the participants, the whole process kind of through and through. And then we opened it up to questions. And when we did that, everybody was sort of staring and looking, and there was this sort of palpable tension in the room. And our lead consultant in that case sort of recognized this and asked all the leaders who were going to get feedback to raise their hands. And there were, I think, maybe 45 of them that raised their hands. And she said, okay, I'd like all of you to leave, just out of the room. If you've got questions, we can address them later, but let's get you guys out of the room. And everyone was kind of looking around like, well, that was unexpected. So they went and closed the door. And she turned to the rest of the folks and said, okay, so what's really going on here? What are you guys so worried about? And as soon as all the leaders were out of the room, everyone just, it all kind of came out about how much they didn't trust anybody and, how could they really trust this process and would the leaders really take it seriously? And it was a really critical moment to kind of just open up and help them see that this was an opportunity to address the lack of trust that they had, to use an anonymous survey, that they needed to be constructive in their feedback but also very clear, and that that it might be hard to walk into their boss's office and tell them what they were struggling with, but here's a way to really be clear about it and helpful, and that our whole purpose was to try to move through and past that lack of trust. And we ended up with a huge response rate. Almost everyone participated. And they also, as our coaches worked with those individuals that had been asked to leave, we recognized there was very tough feedback in there, and they really had to do hard work. I think, frankly, just the fact that they got up and were asked to leave also sort of opened their eyes. So this process can be incredibly powerful for transforming an organization that might on the surface not be ready, but I think you need to really be careful and aware that lack of readiness could stifle impact. I think had our consultant not done that, it was very likely that there would have been stifled. The feedback would have been very constrained and neutral, and the response rate would have been quite a bit less. So, trying to find a way to break through that mistrust, if that's the case, is important. And again, you can see the importance of clarity of purpose in there as well. So, again, just really looking at safety and trust as a prerequisite, and it may be that your organization isn't yet ready for a process like this. So next, number 3, let's turn to selecting a feedback instrument. So before I jump into kind of some of the details here, this might be a good opportunity to get some feedback from the audience. So I think what we're going to do is ask Jesse here, while I introduce this topic, to do a poll, and that poll should be asking you, in the process that you're using, are you using a custom 360 tool or an off-the-shelf tool? And if you aren't using one yet, if you're not in the middle of it, you can just skip it, and that's fine. But just to get a sense of whether folks are using an off-the-shelf tool or a custom tool. So this kind of core decision about what your tool is going to look like and whether it is off-the-shelf sort of standard content or custom content to your organization is a significant one. I would say that kind of the underlying issues have to do with efficiency, cost, and a little bit culture of the organization. In general, if you're using an off-the-shelf tool, it's going to be more efficient. I can't tell you how many times I've heard a client say, "Well, we don't need to recreate the wheel of leadership, right? We just want a core leadership model," and that's great. That can be a really efficient way, particularly if you don't have the internal talent or wherewithal, or you're kind of new to 360s. That can be a good way to sort of start, and you've got some nice established content. Some sort of culturally, some organizations really need that like established survey with national norms and research-based, often sort of science-based organizations will push for that kind of model that's been well developed, and that's what they want. So those could be some considerations. It's obviously a little bit less expensive. You don't have to pay to develop the tool up front. So those are some good reasons to use an off-the-shelf tool, and they can be very valuable. On the other hand, the custom tools are a great opportunity to really drive change in an organization, because you can start using the language of your organization. You can put aspirational feedback in there. I'm going to give the case example I have of a custom tool. So there are some, the custom approach really can help make that tool feel like it fits the organization. It's suited for where the leadership is at today and where you might want to move it forward to. There aren't any. I mean, it could be as simple as if you're in a NGO or something like that, and the survey is talking about customers, people may feel like it doesn't fit. So, or maybe there's a particular language or term. I remember talking with Alan Church at Pepsi about this one time, where I was arguing the case for an off-the-shelf tool and said, well, come on, customer orientation, how many ways do you have to slice that pie? And he said, oh, no, we don't have customer orientation. We have customer mania. If you call it customer orientation here, no one will believe in it. So, okay, there's a great reason for maybe the underlying construct is not different, but the language is different enough that it's more accepted. So a lot of good reasons to go custom. What did we find, Jesse, in terms of what people are doing today on the call?
So it looks like 93% of the people on the call are already doing custom, with 7% doing off the shelf.
All right. Well, that's also pretty consistent with our benchmark study results. Our benchmark study we're actually working now on our 6th edition, which you'll hear about later. But our 5th edition of our benchmark study in 360 feedback practices, where we ask companies, well, what are you doing? Also found a very low, and in fact, somewhat shrinking percentage of folks using off-the-shelf tools. I believe it was 19% this last year. So it does happen. They are being used, but it seems that customizing and tailoring it is kind of winning the day, if you will. But again, there are good purposes and good reasons for it. Either way, I think you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. But customization has a lot of power there. So let's look at a case where we did just that. So we were working with a large U.S. university in their IT department, and the department had been fairly complacent and reactive to concerns, sort of customer oriented in a way, but not cutting edge, not bringing things to their internal customers that were furthering their efforts, or was sort of, oh, what do you need? You want this? Great, I can get that for you. Was kind of the orientation. And they were also, there had been a number of sort of challenges, I think, in implementations that the IT department had done. They had lost a lot of trust within the organization around their ability to deliver, and especially to deliver, at a price and on time that was sort of reasonable. But so they got a new CIO, and when he came in, he really wanted to turn the apple cart up, and he wanted to change the department's relationship to the organization and make it a very high-level sort of service-oriented organization that was, delicately balancing kind of what customers are asking for and helping them see what they might need, and introducing new ideas that they didn't have. But he realized that the leadership there needed to adopt these practices, and that they hadn't done that. And it wasn't him getting up there saying, "Hey, let's go do this," that was going to work. And so he was very drawn to the idea of a 360 tool that allowed him to shape the content and the questions of the survey as a way of messaging expectations for leaders that were changing. So, he had questions in there that were things like, challenges others, challenges the status quo, creates transformational changes to improve the business, things like this that were paradigm changing for many of those leaders. And indeed, when the first implementation, I think we worked with them 12 years running every year. And the content actually evolved over those years to continue pushing the organization forward. But these new behaviors started these conversations. After each leader got their feedback, they would meet with one of our coaches and spend about an hour kind of talking through what the insights were. And what they found was that there was a whole lot of, what do you mean? This isn't what I should be doing. But indeed, it was. It was, well, no, new CIO was pretty clear. These are the behaviors. Okay. So it started conversations in a very personal way, rather than some sort of town hall, hey, we should do this. Let's all be, more innovative. It was very personal and directed into their roles. And so I think there's an opportunity here, for making that kind of change within an organization. But it's also important to recognize that embedded within this was not just the survey. It's not the survey itself. To say that, oh, hey, do a 360 survey that's aspirational and that'll move your leaders forward, well, that's a really important contributor. But also, this new CIO was really messaging all of these behaviors in town hall meetings. They did that top-down rollout that I talked about, where the first leaders in, it was actually him and his kind of top executive team, were completing the surveys, getting the feedback, sort of showing people that they were taking it seriously and looking at themselves. And they came back and said, hey, when I got my feedback, there was some tough stuff in here, and here's what I worked on. So I think this is an example where, the survey content, that custom content, can really be used to drive change if you're thoughtful about it, right? Rather than trying to just come up with, let's make sure we're measuring leadership, it's let's make sure we're measuring leadership the way we need it to be to move where we want to go. And if you're thoughtful about it that way and engage your leaders at the top, you'll see that those surveys can be an extremely powerful lever for change and moving leaders forward. Okay, I think we're on number 4. I've lost count at this point. We're somewhere in the middle, the muddy middle. Selecting a vendor. The easy thing is just hire 3D Group, right? That's obvious, but no, there are some other guidelines and thoughts that you might consider. A couple things. It's pretty widely recognized that having an external provider is a pretty important thing. One of the chapters in the book, the ethics chapter by Bill Macy, is really clear on this. Using an outside provider allows you, particularly if in HR, to kind of not be stuck with an executive, a CEO, asking you for sensitive data that you really shouldn't share, but yet that senior executive can be pretty persuasive. I've actually been in an argument with a CEO of a company that was, very threatening around wanting to know exactly who said what in a particular survey for one of his executives. And I think an HR person in that conversation would have very much struggled because undoubtedly their job would have been on the line. In that particular case, it turned out great. He listened to me and did not get the data and was thankful that I didn't give it to him, but it did take a little while to get to that. The other aspect of this, of course, is that your IT department really can dig in if you've got the data internally. It's how confidential is it, I guess, is the question, and how much will people really trust it? So the other thing, of course, is that there's some expertise, and you want expertise in your vendor. You really want someone who can help you think through the process, who can bring information about best practices to you and support you in communicating to the organization both up, down, and across about why you're doing it a particular way. Everybody's got their own idea of the way a 360 should be done. So really having a partner in a vendor is important, and looking at it that way and leveraging somebody who's going to be there for you and supporting you when you're implementing, when you're rolling it out, et cetera. So here's a case where we worked with a large pharmaceutical company, and it was a classic sort of process most of you probably are very familiar with of an RFP with lots and lots and lots of check boxes that had been very thoroughly vetted by multiple functions, IT, HR, procurement, et cetera. Large pool of people responding to the RFP. Very thorough process. Senior leadership involved all the way to the top as part of a large kind of rollout of a new leadership model and a new, again, linked to a strategy. So the CEO was very actively involved. And so what we found in this process that I thought was interesting is, we went through the classic kind of paring down and whatnot, and we got down to the bottom three, and then we presented. And what happened as we ended up being selected, of course, to work with the company. It would be a much less interesting story if we hadn't. But what we found was that while the very beginning of the process was highly transactional and really based on, our security protocols and, our insurance requirements and all these things, that once we'd sort of gotten those things taken care of and it was clear we were capable of delivering at the level they were looking for, then the process shifted, and we really the client started asking us to kind of customize their solution in ways that you really couldn't put in an RFP. And in fact, I think they had discovered through the RFP that there were things that they thought they wanted that they didn't want or they weren't sure about. And so I think there's a certain turning point at which we got into a conversation with them about design and purpose and tactics and strategy to achieve those purposes and how we might shape the process. And I think it's very important when you're doing this that you keep open that possibility. Sure, you're going to know what you want. You're going to a lot of the stuff that's in there is going to be necessary. But once you've gotten there, you really need to make sure that you've got a thought partner who can help you think through options, consider how to approach things, and make sure there is this kind of creative space. I think if you finish your RFP process and go, great, we've got our vendor, we know what we're going to do, off we go, you're likely overlooking an opportunity to really improve that process. So our experience in this case was sort of stark in that it was so transactional at the outset, but yet it really did migrate into a much more kind of creative and design-oriented conversation, which was really valuable. And we ended up with a great process. So one of the key things here, and I've spoken about this in front of large groups and been very controversial about the idea that 360 feedback is not software. It clearly software is necessary and it's a really important component, but I think it's sort of necessary but not sufficient. You really have to think about design, what implementation support is going to look like, how you handle kind of the odd things that occur. What will you do when your CEO is, mad because somebody got a weird rating and they want to know who said what? Like, just having that kind of support is important. However, it is also important to look at your own relationship as an HR group with IT, and I would throw procurement in there too, although IT tends to be more of the ongoing relationship that's important. And those two relationships, HR to IT, are not always as smooth as anyone would like, but attending to it will make a big difference because you need the software to work, but you also are going to have all these design requests and considerations that you're going to need to collaborate between your vendor, your HR needs, and IT. So making sure to include them is really important. All right. I think we might be up to 6 if I'm not mistaken. Let's look at process design. I've talked a bit about design, but one of the key things about 360s are often struggle because of poor planning. You really need to think through how are we going to do this? What's the rollout going to be? What are the populations, different levels? How many different languages? How are you going to communicate? There's a real thorough plan is going to be extremely valuable. I think the construction site makes a great point. If you go in trying to build something like this and don't have a good plan, you're gonna really struggle. So I think being planful, and again in partnership with a provider that can really act as a partner. And the key insight here is it's complicated. There are lots and lots of decisions. In fact, when we did our first benchmark study, we sort of structured it very much in that way, and it's been that way ever since, where we look at, what are those design decisions? I think we've got 19 core areas with sub-decisions within that you're going to have to make. It's everything from how long the survey is to who's going to get it to who's going to get a copy of the report. I mean, this is a very important thing to know up front. It sounds like a very small tactical thing, but it will change radically what the impact of the process is and the meaning and purpose in the eyes of the participants, as well as the raters. So there are a bunch of design decisions that need to be looked at. And the critical thing to recognize is that those design decisions will have a strong impact, not just on how difficult or hard it is or easy it is for you to implement, but on the data themselves. So the data themselves will change based on the way you design the process. And if you're looking for reliable and valid data, you want to make sure that process is as true as possible to the key components that make for a successful process and again, reliable, valid data. So in thinking about that, there's one case that kind of came to mind that I think was really critical example of that. So we're working with a large U.S.-based company, and the CEO wanted to do an evaluation of his VP of underwriting and did a 360 process, but called us up and said, hey, I need to do this 360 process, and I need the data tomorrow. We said, oh, really? Okay. Okay, sure, we can do that. It's going to take, people are going to need to respond to surveys really fast. And so he said, no problem, that's fine. I'll have my assistant contact each of the raters, and we worked out kind of who the rater groups were going to be and which survey. It was all pretty simple. Here was a good example where Offtheshelf survey was fantastic. And so we said, okay, sure, we'll send out the survey invitations, and we got the email addresses, and it was kind of, fastest process I've ever seen. But we pulled it together, sent out the survey invitations, and that afternoon, his assistant called every single rater and told them they needed to open up their email, log into the survey, and fill it out, and that she would be happy to wait until the survey was done, and then she'd get on the phone and call the next one. So it worked out great. We had 100% response rate, but we also had 100% really high scores. And what happened here, I mean, literally the VP, when he opened up his report, he laughed. He knew how quickly it had been done, of course. He'd filled out his own self-survey. He'd gone through the process as well. But, I mean, the data, there was almost no variance at all. There was no willingness to be honest and clear about what was really going on. And so while the process was, effective in one regard or a couple, it was certainly, great response rates, and indeed the CEO got his report. I think he realized afterwards that the process itself had a pretty significant impact on the data. So I think recognizing that and asking yourself the question, and there's some guidelines, if you're in a low trust environment and using the scores mechanically for performance management, you're likely to get inflated scores with low variance. So there's kind of a pretty standard kind of thing. But there are few other, I think, standard guidelines that you can simply say, oh, well, if you do this, then this is what will happen with the data. I think in many cases you have to ask yourself, all right, if we do this, what's likely to be the impact on the data in terms of an accuracy and honesty standpoint, which is just critical. If you don't have honest feedback, you really can't do much with the data. So just thinking in your organization, this particular approach, what is going to work and what isn't going to work, what are people going to trust, what aren't they going to trust. Dave Bracken and I's article on the factors that you need for 360s to be effective in driving change. One of the 4 pillars was around credible data. So you've got to really think about what am I doing that's going to make the data credible or not. And just think about each step. We've got a bunch of tools that, again, whether it's the benchmark study, the article we wrote on change, that can help you think that through and identify the components. But don't think that you can just kind of do a boilerplate process and get clear, honest results. Certainly not in 24 hours. All right, participant preparation. Important to think about the people themselves that are getting the feedback. So what is it that when someone's getting the feedback, how are they prepared? What are they being told about the process? Are they, do they know how they were selected, why they're participating, what the purpose is? Do they know, we occasionally will get questions from folks that are saying, hey, this must have been a mistake. I've been asked to fill out my own self-survey. Well, this belies an assumption on that person's part that, in fact, they shouldn't be looking at the data, their own self-data, that it's really being done to them. So you want to make sure you're getting them ready, if you will. We worked with a biotech company, small, rapidly growing company, trying to scale up. They knew they were going to be hiring and growing fast. So, we worked with them on implementing a 360 for the leaders to try to kind of, get them that level up. Very similar to, in a sense, to the sales organization, but much more focused on orientation. And one of the things we found there is, again, doing that live orientation where we really only spent about 15 minutes, talking through the process, but we spent 45 minutes answering questions. Just made a huge difference. That no amount of the kind of emails and flyers and all that stuff of them reading it was going to make the difference. But being there in the room, asking questions, hearing it from each other, made a huge difference in their willingness to participate and then actually follow through, because they recognized, oh, this is part of us growing and developing as a company. They want us to be the senior, they want to hire people under us, and so they want to level us up to be able to manage those folks. And I think that conversation, that back and forth, was extremely important in this particular organization for preparing them and getting their engagement and involvement. I think that notion of communicating and trying to get buy-in and involvement is absolutely critical in a 360 process. Really think about those leaders themselves. What are they investing? Because they can think back to the example I had where the 42% of people didn't even download their reports. You go through all that effort, you pick the right content, you got the perfect vendor, blah, 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 and then you don't even open the report, right? The preparation piece is just absolutely critical to prevent that kind of, if you will, train wreck. Rater selection, there was a question on this. So identifying the raters is, again, another one of those key things that's going to drive the content of the data and the quality of the data. You get the wrong raters and, the credibility of the data is just going to go way, way down. Identifying raters is something that can be done lots of different ways. Our personal bias is toward the person getting the feedback to identify the raters themselves. Again, it just builds that kind of participation and buy-in in the process up front that's so important. If you're asking somebody to change, you want them to be bought in and involved. So getting them to identify them. Now, of course, the friends and family plan is not so good either, so it's not a bad idea to also engage and involve their direct manager by asking their manager to approve that list. And generally, if someone knows their manager is going to look at the list, they're less likely to pick the friends and family plan. Couple quick guidelines. All direct reports should be included. Your boss should be included. The self absolutely should be included, so you can look at those blind spots and unexpected strengths. And then peers tend to be a little bit more mercurial in terms of, or flexible in terms of, are these folks I've worked with recently? The main thing there is opportunity to observe. Make sure those leaders have had an opportunity to be observed by the people doing the ratings so they get good, solid feedback. And also recognize that the peer group typically will have a lower response rate because they just generally have less interaction. So maybe identifying a few extra folks there to make sure you get your minimums met in order to be able to report the data. So an interesting example we had here was with a large retailer, lots and lots of leaders. The complexity here, again, the planning, et cetera, very important. So, we piped in the data on who the peers, the boss, the direct reports would be for each rater through the HRS to make it logistically less complex. A little quicker too. Rater selection can take a week to 2 week period just to make sure people have time to go in and identify. So if you're trying to do a quicker cycle time, that's one way to do it, is to link it in with the HRS. In this case, they had annual cycles for all these folks, so you can imagine a pretty complex process. It was spread out over months, but each group went through once a year. And then with the top 200 leaders, they did the kind of a one-on-one action planning session with a coach. And in this process, one of the interesting things that our coaches reported back was that over half of the leaders they worked with, and they tracked it at one point because it started just to be a trend, that over half of the leaders looked at their, when they looked at their data, discredited it to the point of really not even being able to engage in the feedback as valuable, right? They literally were looking at the report going, this is useless, there's nothing here of value for me, there's no point. Now think for a moment, if I was in a room, I'd ask all of you to kind of chime in, but just think for a moment, from what I've told you so far, why would over half of the leaders discredit their results? Just literally not see the results as valid in any way, which of course is not going to drive change. Well, the clue is in the third bullet. Every single one of these leaders, when they looked at their list of raters, realized that that raters had been identified to rate them who they had not worked with in over a year. Anyone that works in a large organization with HRS data realizes that every day it's outdated because the turnover and churn and people moving through the organization. So what we found is that while it was very efficient, it wasn't very accurate, and it probably had a really negative impact on their ROI because they ended up with a whole bunch of reports that really weren't too accurate. Wrong raters, bad data. Now, it's likely, of course, and our coaches tried to convince them that, hey, probably the people that haven't worked with you didn't fill it out. But, of course, we didn't know that. And so, it was just very difficult to work with these leaders and get it to work. We migrated them, actually, to a self-nomination with a boss approval process, which radically changed the conversation, radically changed the credibility of the data, and all that. But using that HRS is something, you can do it, but you just want to be cautious. Usually we recommend more using that for the rater pools so that they can kind of pick people and not have to type it all in, but not so much for identifying who exactly is rating who. Unless you happen to have that one really stellar, the one company with like perfect HRS data that's always up to date, then you may want to be a little bit careful there. All right, post-assessment problems. So what happens after you get the feedback, and what do you do there? A lot of what we've talked about is kind of planning and roll-up and getting the data and giving it to people. but what happens after the fact? So our research shows that about 2/3 of companies actually provide a one-on-one follow-up to discuss the results. And we find that in our experience, this is a huge upswing in terms of return on investment for companies, that the impact of 1 hour with an external, ideally external, it doesn't have to be, but ideally external person working with a leader on what is this and what do I do with it, what does it mean, how do I boil it down into something meaningful and actionable, just really moves the dial a lot from a change perspective. Now, some of the leaders can do this on their own and they'll be perfectly effective, but in our experience, they can get a lot more out of that one-on-one meeting than they can just by getting a report and a guide on how to kind of work through the report. So an example of this is where we have a client that's a large U.S.-based education nonprofit. We've got kind of a central function and then regional affiliates that are fairly independent. They've put a lot of work into a custom survey. They've got this kind of structured annual process, and they don't really provide any coaching. There's not a lot of communication. It's sort of a service that's available, and people can get it when they want. And these steps actually sort of suggest this. But what we found is that there's they still continue using the process, and they've been working with us for about 5 years, but their usage is just kind of on this steady decline. And I think this is a really great example where the company's not put a lot of emphasis on what you do after you get a report. I think it's really important to recognize that while a lot of your work is before, the leader's work is after, and that's where the action is. That's where the value is to the company. The leader has this report and they do something with it to be better. Right? So what you do with it is, after the report's delivered. So I think when you think back to planning and preparing and such, really recognizing that there needs to be opportunities after that report for them to be held accountable, for them to get support in getting the feedback in ways that will encourage them to take it seriously and use it to actually improve and develop. Again, we find a bunch of leaders will do this on their own. There's a huge group with a little bit of support that will really make a big shift if they get that support, but might not if they don't. All right, last but certainly not least, confidentiality and anonymity. Again, chapter, I think it's 19, the Macy chapter in our book talks about this at great length in very clear terms about the notion of differentiating, for one thing, confidentiality and anonymity. That the data that's collected that's truly anonymous is very different than confidential. I'm not going to dwell in that too much. But I do think it's important to recognize how much effort gets put into this. Things like, again, off our benchmark study, it seems that the norm is for a minimum of 3 respondents being required to report data separately for a particular group. So obviously, if you only have 1 peer respond, it's not going to be very confidential or anonymous. So making sure there are some, aggregated results that are being presented. Making it clear to the raters and the participants that in no case are names attached to the feedback. The idea here is that this is going to, free people up to really provide much more honest feedback because they're not worried about retribution, or it's actually rarely, I think, retribution, but more that they're just might be worried about the relationship. That if they, are being critical of somebody, that the relationship may be strained. So an interesting example of this came, I think it was 3 years ago, with a professional service company where we were working with the board to evaluate the CEO, and they had a long history of doing 360s where the open-ended comments at the end of the survey were summarized by either the vendor or HR. And it didn't even occur to them, actually, to tell us this because they just assumed it. And so we gave them the reports, which is what we typically do, and they contained verbatim comments. They were pretty surprised by it. It was just a clear miscommunication, strong miscommunication. I don't know. But what we found, sort of long story short, is we found that the organization was under a lot of strain. It was a fairly new CEO, and he was pretty unpopular, and he didn't know it. And the comments in the past, I think, that had been summarized did not help that problem at all. And when he got the honest, direct feedback in their words, which was very constructive, it wasn't vindictive at all, it opened his eyes in ways that the summaries simply would not have. So it was interesting to us, and it was sort of one of those happy miscommunications where he was able to leverage that feedback to really look carefully at himself and make huge changes. So in a way, the over concern about making the data confidential, which was, it was all, the comments were not labeled by name or anything like that, but the prior efforts the company had made to be overly concerned about confidentiality probably had constrained the kind of change that they really needed in the organization. So kind of that dialed just right level of confidentiality seemed to make a huge impact, because when he heard it in the employees' words, it really stuck home. Okay, that's 9 things in a short period of time. I want to illustrate what they all are kind of on one page, and then point out that these 9 are each covered in a chapter that John Fleener wrote, chapter 14 in our book. He goes into some more conceptual detail, less case examples, but if you want to dig deeper, that chapter is a really, really great resource. So with that, I think Jesse wants to make a shameless pitch for 2 resources, and then I know there's some really great questions. I'll use as much time as you want on those, and maybe Jesse, you can just I'm happy to go over if people have the time on answering those questions. Maybe you can help me see if people are engaged or interested in that.
Okay, great. Thanks, Dale. So the first of these resources you should be familiar with now. This is the newly released Handbook of Strategic 360 Feedback, written and edited by the industry's top experts. So as a thank you for joining us today, here's a discount code and the link to purchase the book on Oxford University Press website. Also, as Dale's mentioned throughout the presentation, we are doing our new 360 feedback benchmark study that allows us to share this data with you. If you participate, you'll receive an advanced copy of the 2020 edition and the opportunity to win a copy of the Handbook of Strategic 360 Feedback. The survey is open until the end of June. So I'll be sending out more information about both of these resources as a follow-up to today's webinar, along with Dale's slides. So now let's get into your questions.
And I do think that discount's worth like $30, so it's a pretty good deal.
Yeah.
All right.
The first question was, how can you select tools that can span various career levels whilst creating a common language for the company?
Yeah, that's one of the great opportunities for 360. I love this idea of the common language for the company. That's I didn't cover that as much in the custom surveys, but that's one thing that's really powerful about a 360 tool. Is you're talking about behaviors that are needed for leaders to be effective, and you can use language. I used the example of customer mania before. That helps people to reinforce and communicate together around behaviors that are expected. I think it's not that difficult to come up with sort of a cascaded competency model where you look at 3 different layers of leadership or even individual contributors. And I wouldn't generally, what we see is you don't get too caught up in the like one-to-one this behavior to that behavior, but kind of what does I'll keep picking on that one. What does customer mania mean for an executive, and then what does customer mania mean for a frontline supervisor? And just they're both talking about customer mania. It's important to both of them. It lines up with the business strategy, but it may look a little different, and the behaviors and the items themselves may look different. So the commonality is really in the broad dimension, less so than the individual behaviors. And occasionally you'll get an individual behavior, but I think that's really the approach, is to just look at, and actually Pepsi has some really phenomenal work in this, where they've lined up competency models at multiple layers. In fact, they just won an award for their work in that area. If whoever asked this question, if they're interested, I'd be happy to send the article that they wrote that kind of shows some of this. But I think 360s just are really great at making actionable those competencies at multiple layers and helping people kind of see that cascading growth.
Okay, the next question is from Victor. I would be interested in hearing more about trends in sharing 360 data with individuals and groups other than the participant.
Right. So, so the participant, I talked about that case with the sales group, right, where he was thinking, the participant wouldn't even get the data. So one of the things, our benchmark study has actually data exactly on this. For example, in our latest study, we found only surprisingly low in my mind, but only 84% of companies gave the feedback even to the participant. Okay, so and you think, well, who are you giving it to? They're giving it to the direct manager, HR, et cetera, obviously for a different purpose than pure development. Very hard to develop somebody if they don't see the report. Only half the companies are giving it to the direct manager, about half, again, human resources, and then a third or so the feedback coach, although that's probably influenced a bit by the ones that don't have a feedback coach because they're just dropping the report off. So there are different uses, I think, and different individuals that you might get those reports to. I just would be really clear with folks up front about that. And hopefully here, end of the year, we will have the latest results on how those trends are shaping or changing. And if you'd like, again, we can get you a copy of the, in fact, I think, Jesse, we're going to send that out anyway. We'll send you a copy, I think, of the benchmark study, so you can look that up directly.
So the next question is, what components are different when a 360 is used for performance versus development?
Again, perfectly suited for our benchmark study. Our last one, I don't think the next one's going to focus on this in the same way, but we had sort of a call out where we pulled out specific results differentiated by whether the company used their process for performance management or for development. And there were a few that did stand out in terms of, kind of more stark differences. So, for example, survey length. Performance management tools tend to be a little bit shorter. Clearly, who's receiving a copy of the report, participants manager and HR far more frequently getting the report in performance management than in development, sort of development only. There's some differences in terms of previous year's scores, which is a very complex issue, but maybe 40+% are looking at previous year's scores with performance management tools, but only about a quarter are doing that with development only tools. So there are a couple of kind of key areas there where there are differences. I would say also, again, back to the book, Chapter 3, Emily Campion and her brother and her dad wrote a really phenomenal chapter on performance management best practices with 360s. They come up with 52, I think, identified and referenced best practices. So they've got as many as like 30 references on one of them to sort of illustrate why this particular thing is a best practice. When we were writing the book, I remember talking with John Fleener about this, and he said that he had shown it to some folks at CCL, and they'd been talking about it, of course, CCL being a very strong advocate for development-only practices. And they were struck by looking at those 52 best practices by how much they lined up with best practices for development only. So I think in many ways, the process may look very similar, but you're communicating something slightly different and using it slightly differently. But there are a few key data points where there are, again, like who's getting the report and things like that, where there are differences. And I think as long as you're thoughtful about impact on the data, and some of the research that shows there's been a big interest in, this is a big long topic, but there's been a big interest in differences between administrative, quote unquote, administrative uses versus developmental uses, and impacts on the data. And the stuff that I've seen seems to suggest that one of the biggest covariates there is trust in the organization. So if there's good trust within the organization, then it's more easy to use the process for performance management. If there's low trust, there tends to be a lot more manipulation and things like that.
Okay, we have one or two more questions if everyone wants to stay on the line. We had one question that just came in that I wanted to ask from Pete. How is GDPR and other data privacy requirements affecting how you think about and implement 360 feedback processes?
Yes, data privacy, very important stuff. I think you've got to be. That's a space that's changing radically. We've had a couple of shifts in Europe that have, that we end up just, you just sort of need to follow along. In some ways, with those requirements, because it's very hard to anticipate and be ahead of them, because you don't really know where they're going to shift. But I would say that data privacy is extremely important, and I think in 360s, obviously the data themselves are well protected by any good vendor. It tends to be that the personally identified information that we operate with is mostly name and email address, and so those are not social security number or credit card numbers, right? I think it's important that people have a right to purge their name or at least encrypt their name and their email address so those things aren't floating around. But it is important also to recognize that we're not holding on to health records. The real sensitive information that we've got is name and email address. Obviously, they're personal data, but again, those are typically well protected anyway.
Okay, so our next question from Jessica is, what are the common roadblocks experienced when working to launch a robust 360 process, and how do successful companies overcome them?
Well, that's a great question. Thanks, Jessica. I think I've hit on a few of them. I guess the things that I would highlight is I find it to be very effective, particularly with 360s. You're asking people to look at their behavior as a leader to understand how they're affecting or being affected by others around them. It's not a personality test. It's feedback about how you're showing up as a leader and impacting others, which is kind of the base of leadership. So the idea that you start at the top, that the leaders at the top of the organization are bravely going forth and doing this themselves and taking it seriously and modeling, can make a huge positive impact. It also helps because if you're doing this, and we can see the custom surveys where you're sort of shaping aspirational content, it's a really incredible lever for someone at the top of an organization, a CEO, to say, this is what I expect of my leaders. When you put those behaviors out and you make them concrete and clear, and then you ask leaders to be measured on them, and you yourself are measured on them, and then you show your attention to feedback from others, it just makes a huge impact. So starting at the top, I think, will break down a lot of barriers. And showing him or her, hey, this is a lever for you. This is not something. Every implementation from IT, procurement. Hey, if we can just get the CEO on board, of course. This is a particularly unique thing because it is about the leadership behaviors themselves. The other thing is the 4 pillars of change that Dave Bracken and I talk about in terms of making sure that content is relevant. It's in the terms people can relate to, and it relates to pushing things forward, that they find the data credible, that you're holding them accountable for change, and then again, that you're getting census participation across so that you're really trying to impact a broad swath of people. It's not that you're pulling out 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 people. That's how you're going to make the biggest impact. If you're using it for individuals, it can be effective, but it's just going to be less so than if you're using it more broadly. And then the last is just being really clear about purpose and knowing what that purpose is going in and recognizing that the design components are going to absolutely be affected by that purpose. Have the upfront conversation with HR leadership and senior leadership to make sure everyone's aligned. And why are we doing this? What do we want to get out of it? What is the value here for us? And then the kind of water you swim in is around the trust, and make sure there's some transparency about the process. When people feel like it's sort of secret and we don't know where the data are going, this is where GDPR is really good. It gets people nervous, and they're less likely to be honest, and then your data goes down. So being real clear about what it is, why it is, and how it's being done can make a big difference.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Dale. I think that's a good place to stop for today. Thank you again for the fantastic questions. If you have questions we didn't address here today, reach out to us, 510-463-0333. Check out our website at 3dgroup.net. Thank you all again for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.